The show opens in 1969 and takes place in a parallel dimension. The first moon landing surprises everyone in the world. The Soviets, however, are responsible for achieving this. As a Soviet cosmonaut becomes the first person to set foot on the moon, NASA employees are in disbelief. Deke Slayton, the chief of the astronaut office, makes the announcement during a meeting the next day that Apollo 11, America's most recent attempt to send a man to the moon, is set to launch in 2 weeks. So he gives the go-ahead for astronauts Michael Collins, Buzz Aldrin, and Neil Armstrong to carry out their planned training. The news that the Soviet Union had sent the first man to the moon, however, has affected the astronauts' morale. Deke decides to give them the weekend off because they seem upset. The astronauts go to a bar that is well known among NASA employees because they appreciate this. A reporter approaches Ed Baldwin and Gordo Stevens there, 2 astronauts. It turns out that the 2 were part of the Apollo 10 crew, whose objective was to approach the moon's surface and assess the landing environment for Apollo 11. Now, they're prepared to embark on the Apollo 15 mission. In addition to bugging Ed and Gordo about losing to the Soviets, the reporter makes nasty comments about them returning to Earth without visiting the moon. A drunk Ed is offended by this and launches into a tirade against NASA. He says the space agency is afraid to take chances because the first Apollo mission failed and ended in a disaster that killed the whole crew. The action then shifts to NASA headquarters, where Wernher von Braun, director of the Manned Spacecraft Center, Thomas Paine, and astronaut office chief Deke, question a CIA operative about why NASA was not informed about the Soviet moon landing. The agent responds that the CIA reported 2 unmanned rocket launches, but it later turned out that they were actually manned. Thomas begs to move up the launch of the Apollo 11 because he is desperate to get an American on the moon as soon as possible, but von Braun opposes the suggestion. Ed's prior remarks against NASA went viral the next day. Deke reprimands him and informs him that von Braun has decided to withdraw him from the Apollo 15 mission because this evidently annoys his superiors. Ed will instead be given a regular office job. The latter tries to argue against the choice, but Deke doesn't pay attention. The narrative then jumps ahead a month, and Apollo 11 is now prepared for takeoff. Gene Kranz, the flight director at Mission Control, addresses the entire staff in a speech intended to inspire them and remind them that the mission's success will determine how far America will go in space in the future. Apollo 11 ultimately launches a short while later as the entire country anxiously watches from their homes. To everyone's surprise, the spacecraft successfully travels into orbit around the moon. After that, Michael remains in lunar orbit as Neil and Buzz travel towards the moon's surface. Karen, Ed's wife, attends a watch party Marge is hosting as Deke observes the mission from the bar. When the 2 start conversing, Marge reveals that Deke might reinstate Ed in the Apollo 15 mission if he publicly claims that the reporter misquoted him. Karen points out that her husband places a high value on duty, honor, and the truth, hence he would never consent to it. In another location, Neil and Buzz approach the moon's surface slowly and are ready to land. But as they approach, they have trouble securing a favorable location. The 2 start to fear as a result, forcing them to land suddenly. Due to this, Apollo 11's telemetric connection and all other forms of contact are lost to mission control. After several hours pass without hearing from Apollo 11, von Braun comes to the conclusion that the spacecraft most certainly crashed. Even Michiel, who is in orbit, is asked to come back to the planet. However, just afterwards, Neil sends a communication to Mission Control, informing them that Apollo 11 has successfully landed on the moon. The entire NASA staff experiences euphoria as a result of this. While Neil raises the Stars and Stripes and becomes the first American on the moon, they begin to rejoice. Soon after finishing their mission on the moon, Neil and Buzz rejoin Michael in orbit. The 3 of them then began their journey toward Earth. After 2 months, Ed has had enough of working behind a desk. He confronts Deke one day and requests to be added back to the Apollo 15 crew. But the employer is still averse to taking him back. Later, NASA Administrator Thomas Paine calls a conference with the other top officials and announces that he has some unfavorable information. He believes that the Soviets intend to build a lunar outpost there. Thomas is adamant about averting another humiliation after already losing a race to them. Therefore, he gives von Braun the go-ahead to seize the initiative and establish the first military presence on the moon before the Soviets. Additionally, Thomas states that President Richard Nixon himself gave the order. Meanwhile, it was discovered that von Braun created the V-2 rockets while working in Germany. The Germans employed these rockets during World War II, which resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of innocent civilians. Von Braun consequently disagrees with the president's directives, saying that he does not want to turn space travel into another battleground. Later, he speaks with his student, NASA engineer Margot Madison. Jean, the flight director, appears to be interviewing her for a post at Mission Control. Unfortunately, things don't go as planned during the interview, and Margot gets angry and exits the office. The following day, Von Braun enters her office and proudly declares that she is the first woman to ever work in Mission Control, despite the fact that she is confident she won't be chosen. Margot is thrilled when she hears this and gives him a bear hug. In the following scene, a lawmaker and administrator Thomas Paine approach Ed. The latter presents an opportunity for Ed to rejoin the Apollo 15 program, but only if he helps them out. Ed will have to discredit Von Braun by giving a bogus testimony in front of the committee looking into NASA's mistakes. Ed is wary about accepting the offer since, despite their differences, he respects Von Braun. Simply asking him to consider it, the congressman reveals that even the president supports it. A few weeks later, Ed is spotted in Washington, D.C. during a congressional hearing. To the surprise of the congressman, he doesn't blame Von Braun for the Apollo 10 mission, but instead takes the fall for it. Later, he decides to rejoin the Navy after leaving NASA. The hearing committee, however, is able to corner Von Braun by bringing up his professional affiliation with Nazi Germany. Von Braun argues that his work at NASA is unaffected by the Third Reich's misappropriation of his work and shows deep regret about it. The congressman responds by releasing numerous images and concrete evidence that Von Braun had also been a member of the SS, the Nazi secret police that was notorious for its atrocities against Jews. This turns out to be Von Braun's final blow, and he is finally let go from his position at NASA. The action then shifts to the Apollo 12 mission's takeoff, which is planned to explore the moon and locate a feasible location for the lunar base. Deep gives Ed some good news and pays him that day. After Von Braun was fired, the new director made the decision to rehire him for the Apollo 15 mission. Ed is thrilled by the news, since he has always wanted to do something for his nation. Karen shows up and urges them to watch the news as the two resume their conversation. Unexpectedly, the news indicates that the Soviet Union has dispatched another spaceship to the moon, and that this time, a female Russian cosmonaut has successfully landed there, becoming the first woman to do so. The feat infuriates the Americans, and as pressure mounts on them, they decide that building a lunar outpost before the Soviets is their top priority. Jean and Deep therefore opt to also designate Apollo missions 13 to 15 to look at prospective locations for a lunar outpost. Thomas Paine, the head of NASA, walks into the meeting shortly after and informs the two that the president now wants a woman on the moon. Since there are no female astronauts, this is a dilemma for NASA. Thomas does offer the names of two possible candidates, Molly Cobb and Patty Doyle. Before it was abandoned in the early 1960s, both of them were a part of the now-defunct Mercury 13 project, which had the goal of launching women into space. Deep considers the two women, then he is given the names of further possibilities, one of which is NASA engineer Danielle Poole. Later, Thomas informs Deep that the president has proposed the notion of sending Gordo Stevens and his wife Tracy, a former pilot, to space. Deep is hesitant to accept the proposal, but Thomas coerces him. Later, Deep goes to Gordo's house to inform the couple about the engagement. To his astonishment, they adore the concept and readily embrace it. Tracy becomes concerned when she notices Gordo acting out of character, and it is later revealed that Deke had promised him a spot on the Apollo 15 mission if he could persuade his wife to pursue astronaut training. After that, we are transported to 1970. Tracy enrolls in her astronaut training class along with 19 other female applicants. Deke introduces himself and warns the women that the training will be quite demanding. The ones who receive the top grades will move on to the program's next phase after all of them have been graded. Tracy, in particular, finds it challenging to keep up with the other students when the semester begins. She consistently comes in last place since there are just 10 contestants left. A furious dispute between Gordo and Tracy develops when Tracy begins to ponder leaving the program. Although he attempts to persuade Tracy that it is a great opportunity, she thinks that he is only doing this for himself. The next scene shows us at a NASA meeting where people are discussing some satellite-taken photos of the moon. The images suggest that there might be ice in the area. Jean makes the comment that water on the moon might completely alter things. An engineer underlines that they could be able to drink the water, cultivate plants, and even produce rocket fuel. Although Ed says they will learn more about it on the Apollo 15 mission, this cannot be guaranteed. After the meeting, Thomas asks Deke about the program for training female astronauts, and the latter responds that he has organized training in the desert for the women. This is because he wants to have them ready for a scenario that might occur if their landing from space onto uncharted territory goes wrong. Deke informs the female participants in the desert survival training about their upcoming test. Everyone will be evaluated and timed according to their unique performances, and they will all have to arrive at a specific location in the desert. All the women set out on their journey in the blazing sun as the test is about to start. Tracy discovers that Ellen, a fellow contender, has hurt her ankle after hours of walking. She sacrifices her own objective without thinking twice, tends to her wounds, and slowly follows Ellen to the finish line. In the meantime, former Mercury 13 members Molly and Patty are the first to cross the finish line. Deke is shocked that Tracy and Ellen are the last survivors, and he is also taken aback by Tracy's compassion. The following day, the names of the final 5 applicants are revealed, and to everyone's amazement, Tracy and Ellen, along with Patty, Danielle, and Molly, made the list. Deke then summons Tracy into his office and praises her for her guts and intuition. But he also points out that she needs to be competent and calculating, in addition to having guts. Deke offers Tracy the chance to voluntarily remove her name from the program after saying this. She declines though, saying she is all in and is desperate to become an astronaut. Ed brings the 5 remaining candidates to a Lunar Exploration Module (LEM) simulator on the 200th day of the training course. This simulator can simulate the flight dynamics of the Apollo spacecraft. Here, the applicants will execute fundamental takeoff and landing maneuvers. The first person to enter the LEM is Tracy. A threatening cloud of black smoke is seen emerging from the military base a half hour later as Gordo is passing by it in his car. Gordo hurries to the base out of concern, where he learns that Patty wrecked the module and died as a result. The remaining 4 women are so devastated by the occurrence that they begin to ponder quitting the program completely. John Glenn, a retired astronaut, pays Deke a visit one day at his workspace in NASA headquarters. He actually was the first American to travel into space. John suggests to Deke that it would be best for NASA's future if the women's astronaut project was scrapped. Deke, however, is unwilling to do this because he has been regularly training the female astronauts for about a year. Later, Gene says that satellite photographs indicate a Soviet spacecraft has crashed on the moon, killing at least 1 cosmonaut. He makes this revelation at a NASA meeting. The CIA believes that the Soviets were attempting to establish a lunar base close to the purported ice formations, despite the fact that they have kept the mission and event under wraps. NASA now understands that the Soviets are once more 1 step ahead of them. To Deke's dismay, Thomas approaches him inside his office after the meeting and tells him that the higher authorities have decided to cancel the women's training program. A sudden press conference is then shown taking place at the NASA headquarters. There, Deke addresses the media and unveils Danielle, Ellen, Molly, and Tracy as the first female astronauts to successfully complete NASA's rigorous training program. The reporters are simultaneously delighted and very perplexed by this. Later, Deke approaches Ed to let him know that he has changed his mind about the crew of the Apollo 15 mission, replacing Gordo with Molly. Ed is upset that his friend Frank Sedgwick has been taken off the trip, but Deke has him eat supper with Molly and Frank Sedgwick, the 3rd Apollo cosmonaut. Naturally upset by the news, Gordo returns home intoxicated. Tracy is first enraged by this, but as soon as she finds out that he has been fired from the Apollo 15 mission, she consoles him. In the meantime, Molly's intransigence causes her to argue with her new crewmates Ed and Sedgwick while she is preparing for the Apollo 15 mission. When Margot finds out, she chastises Molly and reminds her that being an astronaut means being flawless in all respects. Being social and cooperative is required for this. Fortunately, Molly responds well to the criticism and changes her behavior. The action then cuts to the day of the Apollo 15 launch, where Ed, Sedgwick, and Molly, the 3 crew members, are strapped into the rocket. As soon as it lifts off, the president calls Deke to congratulate him on the launch. He also cautions Deke that if Molly makes a mistake, he will suffer the repercussions.